Chapter 18. Saying Goodbye. I can't stay here. It isn't home without him. Chris will say, "What about our babies?" And what about our babies? Our babies are gone before they drew their first breaths. If I stay here where I have lost so much, I will taste the ashes of regret in my mouth forever. Carrie's Journal. The little graveyard didn't have much room left, not with its newest addition, and unlike the 4 previous, mostly private ceremonies, this one was well attended. Practically everyone in Tiptonville was here. Carl had whispered to Chris that they had even shut down the Trade Mart for the day. To the right stood Joseph, looking quite tall and somber for his 14 years. Beside him, seated in a well-padded chair with a blanket, was Mr. Lyles. The man was 116 years old, and looked so frail and thin that Chris feared a stiff breeze would blow him away. His rheumy eyes watered, and he clutched a much-abused handkerchief in one hand, while the other plucked randomly at the blanket that swaddled him. Joseph said that Mr. Lyles slept a lot these days and ate little. The teen had volunteered to stay with the old man after a recent fall had left him weak and fragile. Joseph had developed a knack for working with motors, and he had begun helping out Mr. Lyles a few years earlier in the shop. Now he stayed and cared for the old man, fixed meals, and made sure the stove stayed lit. He also manned the store and helped the infrequent customer. Despite the attention, Mr. Lyles had declined steadily during Fenton's illness. Chris wondered what it must be like to outlive your children, your grandchildren, and to see your friends pass before you. How many funerals had Mr. Lyles attended? How many goodbyes? Liza and Carl, along with their 3 children, Molly, John, and little Abby, stood on the left. Liza's face was a mask of grief, her eyes red-rimmed and her nose blotchy. She would not cry, however, in front of the children. Abby, not quite 2 years old, wriggled in her arms, itching to be set down so she could run through the tall grass. Little John, just 3.5 years old, stood holding his dad's hand and looked puzzled by all the people and the mournful tone in the air. Molly Ann, who would be 6 in less than 2 weeks, clutched Carl's other side, her tiny face sad. She had been Fenton's favorite, the first of his great-grandchildren, and he had doted on her. Outside of immediate family and Mr. Lyles, it appeared that the rest of Tiptonville stood outside of the waist-high metal gates. Everyone wore black armbands. Mrs. Jennings, the town librarian, stood close to the fence, grasped it with one frail hand, and wept softly into her handkerchief. Reverend Deeds stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane with one hand, the other arm around his young wife, Grace. He opened a well-worn Bible, riddled with tabs and papers marking different passages. Carrie leaned against Chris. She had miscarried just a week before, and was still weak and tired. She closed her eyes, trying to stop the tears from sliding down her face. Gramps had suffered for so long, and Liza had done everything she could. In another time, when the world had been whole, Gramps could have had bypass surgery. The doctors would have been able to open him up, clean out the clogged chambers, and give him a decade more. But that time, like the country they had long identified with, was gone. The recovery and founding of the new nation was taking its time. This had all taken too long for Fenton. This life they led was harder, with no time for the weak or the sick to heal. not when there were fields to be plowed or the basic necessities to be met. Slowly, his heart had reduced his ability to walk very far or exert himself in much of any way. There were rumblings of a reformation now that the Second American Civil War was officially over. Life was going back to normal. However, that seemed to be happening with more speed on the east and west coasts, not here, not in Tennessee or even the larger southern cities. The citizens of Tiptonville, along with so many other small towns, were still on their own. It had been a difficult thing to see, watching Fenton slowly succumb to heart disease. It had been especially hard for Liza, there in the house, pulled in so many directions. She had 3 small children, the duties of the farm and the townspeople who now regularly visited for their doctoring needs. Jeremy, Carrie still had a hard time thinking of him as Reverend Deeds, stepped forward and began to speak. "We are gathered here today in memory of our friend, a beloved grandfather and member of this community, Fenton Perdue." He opened it to a marked page and began the sermon. "Jesus tells us that we will not know the hour of our death." Carrie's attention wandered from Jeremy to the markers in the small family cemetery. Her gaze came to rest on her father's and mother's graves. Her heart ached at the memory of them, especially her mother, Amy. That last time she had seen her, she had been in the hospital bed, looking so thin, so insubstantial. Carrie had been afraid to hug her, afraid that Joseph, who had just begun crawling, would hurt his frail mother as he wiggled in her arms. It had been 3 days before Thanksgiving, and the hospital reeked of turkey and disinfectant, an unpleasant and disconcerting combination. Fenton had stepped out of the room with Liza and baby Joseph to get a bite to eat at the cafeteria, and Amy had beckoned her daughter closer. "Carrie, sweetheart, come here." Her bony fingers were cold in Carrie's hand. A tear trickled down her mother's pale cheek. "You are so beautiful, and I love you so much. You know that, don't you?" Carrie had nodded, unable to say anything. There are moments when you know it, whether the words have been said or not, that things are not going to get better, that life will never be the same again. Dad was gone, and now Mom was dying too. Carrie could see there was little time left, but her voice seemed to have deserted her. She wanted to tell Mom everything, and beg her not to leave, to just fight harder. "Carrie, sweetie, your sister and little brother need you right now. Even Gramps needs you, and these next few weeks and months will be hard. I know they have already been hard, and that you feel lost and scared right now." Her mother stopped, struggled to breathe, and then continued. "Someday, though, someday you will find love. You will make a family of your own, and you will have babies, and you will laugh and love. Promise me that you will do these things, that you won't wait for the perfect moment, but jump into life and live it and love every moment of it. Promise me that you will find happiness, and that when the time comes to leave, you will do it, and you will go where you need to go, and be who you need to be." Carrie nodded, her eyes full of tears. "I promise, Mom." A moment passed before Carrie mustered the courage to admit, "I stole $5 from Dad's wallet the day before, the day." Her voice faltered. Her mother managed a small chuckle. "I know you did. Your dad told me." She squeezed Carrie's hand with remarkable strength. "Anything else you want to confess?" she asked, her voice cracking with the effort. Carrie struggled for a moment to form the words. I blamed Joseph at first, for making you weak, for making you sick, but I know it isn't his fault, and I promise I will be a good sister and not fight with him or Liza. She could see her mom slipping into sleep, exhausted from their brief discussion. I love you, Mom. Jeremy's words interrupted Carrie's reverie. Even though I walk through the shadow of the valley of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. He continued the Lord's Prayer, and she could hear the others murmuring it softly all around her. Gramps had loved them, grouched at them, guided them, and now he was gone. The memory of her mother's words fell like arrows on her heart. Jump into life, and live it, and love every moment of it. What had she been doing? Carrie couldn't help but feel she had ignored her mother's advice, at least some of it. She had found love and embraced that, but she had somehow lost her way on the rest. As the coffin was slowly lowered into the ground, and her tears, along with many others, flowed freely, Carrie could not shake the feeling. Somehow, I need to change. Somehow, I need to be more than I am right now.